Yeah, and you speak about consciousness as really the new frontier of commodification and how that's wrapped up in the new attention economy. And I think that this is, and you mentioned Buddhism, that you draw on Buddhist philosophical frameworks. And that's really crucial, I think, for people who haven't read the book yet, in order for them to understand the mobilization and the centrality of attention and presence in the project and in your work, to think a bit about the Buddhist tradition and how you're using it. So, you know, for some, it might be a little strange to think about how this ancient spiritual practice can be relevant to, you know, a hypermodern technology like AI. But I think that you're able to make a case for how Buddhist principles provide insights, not only for how we design AI, but for how we might transform our cultural and ethical orientations in ways that enable humanity to co-evolve with AI in a humane way. So we'd like for you to begin to elaborate on the metaphysics of Buddhism. And specifically, how does Buddhism conceptualize the nature of objective reality? And how does Buddhism avoid materialist and idealist reductionism that's common to Western philosophical frameworks? And why is this important to your project?
All right, well, let me maybe begin with a disclaimer. And the disclaimer is that while I approach things from the perspective of Buddhist thought and practice, and have some reasons for that I'll discuss in a moment, I think that the general insight is that Buddhism is a tradition that for 2,500 years has insisted that everything arises interdependently. So this is something that with contemporary ecological thinking, we've sort of become familiar with, but we still tend to labor under the idea that interdependence is the interdependence between two initially independently existing things that develop this kind of contingent relationship, interdependence, that might break down and you revert to independence. So that's like the language of what people are talking about with the interdependence of, say, national economies, and then wanting, you know, protectionism, so we kind of back away from some of that. And I think that's a really deficient understanding of interdependence. Doesn't get us as far as we need to go critically. But I think that you could turn to other traditions, traditions of indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. You could look at African Ubuntu. You could look at lots of other traditions around the world that also take interdependence and relationality as being ontologically basic and start working out from them. But I think Buddhism does differently in seeing that relationality is more basic than things related. That's the basic metaphysical move, is to say at the same time, the cosmos that we live in is karmically configured. And what that means is that consistently held patterns of values, intentions, and actions will always result in consonant patterns of outcome and opportunity. That is, the patterns of values, intentions, and actions that have been playing out over however much time we want to talk about, that configures the opportunities relationally and the outcomes of the relational dynamics that we're currently enmeshed in. So what Buddhism suggests that we need to do is to not just look at matters of physical interdependence, the kind of materialist interdependence that, say, conservation biologists are looking at in ecosystems and saying, well, it's about energy exchanges and about this kind of phenomenon and so on. And as to back away from that and say, but look, this is actually more part of a general phenomenon. We live in a cosmos that is thoroughly based on meaning generation. And the recent stuff that I've been doing, kind of working on a book on consciousness now, I think we can push this all the way back to Big Bang. I think that intent can get pushed all the way back, and that consciousness can get pushed all the way back if we have an understanding of consciousness that's fully relational. But in terms of how it kind of connects to our present concerns, you know, for me, what Buddhism gives us is this tool for being able to look at how values and intentions and the actions informed by them have causal implications for the world that we live in that are not reducible simply to our efforts that are mechanically defined. That it's not just that when we have, for example, the intent of doing harm to another, and we develop something to be able to allow us to do that at a distance, call it a gun. That the gun is something that we can use to harm others at a distance. So I have an intention to harm, whether it's for hunting or for warfare purposes, I create this tool. Buddhism says, okay, but what are the values involved in that? The values are harming at a distance with minimum vulnerability. Okay. If you start scaling that up, then you end up with weapons technology. Now, if technologies are these relational systems that we're a part of, well, on the one hand, I can say, as a human being, I'm never going to own a gun. I've never owned a gun. I've never shot a gun. I will refuse to do so. However, I am still enmeshed within an environment that is configured significantly in terms of the values undergirding weapons technology. It's part of the decision-making processes that are going on in urban ghettos, that are going on in rural America, where people are having shootouts about politics, where it's scaled up to geopolitical stuff that we're seeing, whether it's on the worldwide scheme with what we're just pulling out of Iraq after so many years. Weapons technology changes decision-making environments in consistent ways, consonant with those values that are built into it. But I think that the concern that we've got and what Buddhism allows us to do is say back, well, what's the karma of that? Or what is the karma of our overall technological orientation? And I would say it's been toward control, convenience, and choice as three core values. And let me just pick control as the one that really brings this into sharp focus. What the karmic worldview suggests is that we're not operating in terms of cycles, it's spirals. And the spirals can either be tightening or they can be broadening. But we're always given an opportunity with the outcomes of previously enacted values and interests. We're always given the opportunity to either stay on course, continue putting energy, attention, and effort into those values and intentions and realizing them, or we can try to change course. We can engage in the kind of critical activity of course correction, basic ethics, and change the way that we're valuing things, the way that we're acting in the world. If we don't do that with something like control, let's just say that we don't change, we just keep ramping up control. Well, to get better at controlling our environment, we have to perceive that environment as always being in need of control. If controlling it once, it's at a certain level is enough, then it stops. Then you don't develop it any further. Then you start to say, well, now I want a creative engagement with them. I don't want to control my environment. I want to collaborate with it, whatever. But as long as control is a value, you have to perceive your environment as increasingly in need of control, which eventuates finally in us living in increasingly controlled environments. And that's precisely what we're seeing with intelligent technology and the scaling up of this attention economy 2.0. We're being given choice. We're being given control over what we consume as information seekers, as entertainment seekers, for social connectivity. More and more choice over control and control over what we perceive, but at the cost of living in an increasingly controlled environment from which, because it's technological and not tool-based, we have no exit rights. Our lives are being shaped by these systems, whether we want to participate in them or not. And so I think what Buddhism allows us to do is to pull back and get that large synoptic picture of what are the relational dynamics, how are they affected by the values and intentions at play, and is there anything that we can do about it to sort of start separating out the promise and the perils of intelligent technology?
Actually, yeah, and you mentioned in your response, and I think this is something that's a big part of your book too, is about the idea of karmic ethics. And one of the things that a crucial refrain throughout the book is, who do we need to be present as in order to respond to the predicament of AI? And you mentioned the karmic ethics, but can you maybe speak more to it as a guide to liberating these patterns of attention? And so what are the characteristics or principles of liberating these patterns of attention, and how do they embody karmic ethics?
Well, one thing I should say as a preface, having been trained in Asian and comparative philosophy and having studied the Buddhist tradition from its origins in India through the present, there's not one Buddhist view of anything. Okay, so Buddhism is a multifaceted set of traditions. It's not just one tradition. So what I'm saying about karma is certainly my interpretation based on my study, the kind of practices that I've been engaged in. But I think that what's distinctive about a karmic ethics is that it's not principles-based, And it's not based on a simple matter of allowing everything goes kind of relativism. So basic Buddhist ethics is, how do we conduct ourselves as persons in community with others? Because we always find ourselves as persons in community with others. None of us are born in a blank slate world. We're all born into a world where history's been playing out. We have families, we move into schools and friends and institutions. So we find ourselves in this world. How do we navigate through this world in a way that leads to kushala, outcomes and opportunities? And the term kushala in Sanskrit sometimes gets translated as wholesome. I think that's a pretty anemic translation. And I prefer translating as superlative or virtuosic. So what we're looking for is superlative outcomes and opportunities, superlative virtuosic changes in the relational dynamics that we're participating in. So what that does is allows us to go from saying, is a particular system, let's say a system of justice, delivering good results? You could say, yes, it does. They're better than the results of the system that it replaced. There's the capitalist system proving to be a good system in terms of generally increasing incomes, generally increasing economic productivity. Yes, it's very good at that. Is it a superlative economic system? Is the American justice system a superlative or virtuosic system? And I'd say from a Buddhist perspective, no. The answer is no. And we could see that because of the relational distortions that are taking place as a result of capitalist economics or a kind of so-called blind justice system of the sort that we have in the United States, where maybe what we need is an eyes open justice system rather than a blind justice system. So what Buddhism suggests is that if we are going to engage in human course correction, that's not a one-off activity. It's not that we somehow eventually discover the principles according to which all humanity ought to live for all time. It's not universalist in that respect. It's very, very much committed to the idea that in every circumstance, suffering differs. Your suffering and mine is different. You've got different issues than I do, and how you're going to respond to that is going to be different from mine necessarily and appropriately. But what we can do is to have this idea of taking whatever is the spectrum of bad conduct, mediocre conduct, good human conduct, and going beyond that to realize what is virtuosic or superlative human conduct in this case. So make that concrete. We've got an idea about equity and gender equity in the United States. Been all in the news for the last 5 years, very powerfully so. Issues about Black Lives Matter, also about equity. And the argument has been, well, in terms of equality of opportunity, we've been doing all that we need to do. Everybody's got equality of opportunity. You could go to school, you can work, you could do whatever. It's clearly not enough. So whatever job equality was doing as a value, politically and in terms of seeking justice, it's no longer good enough. So equity is a way, from a Buddhist perspective, of saying, what we're talking about is not non-exclusion and achieving the conditions of non-exclusion, which can be mandated and legally put in place. You can achieve that once and for all. Buddhist ethics says what we're really talking about is increasing gender equity, where equity is understood as quality of inclusion. It's realizing institutions of relational dynamics where everybody involved not just differs from, but differs for others in ways that others appreciate, therefore leading to increasing quality of inclusion. And that's an open-ended phenomenon. You never get to the end of that. So part of what Buddhism is asking us to do is to get rid of this idea that there's a solution. Get rid of the idea that there's an end that we're trying to arrive at. Get rid of the idea of paradise. We're not going to get there. What we can do is realize increasingly paradisical, superlative, virtuosic environments. And I see a guitar hanging up behind Alex. Musical virtuosity is an ongoing horizon-pushing activity. It's relative to a particular community at a particular time. What it means to be a guitar virtuoso is different now after Hendrix and after George Benson and after Andre Segovia. Take your pick for guitar heroes, and yet it continues onward. There's no end to how virtuosic one can be in terms of musicianship. And in ethics, we need the same thing. An idea of ethics as being virtuoso ethicists, And that's why I say this really requires us to be present in an entirely different way than we normally are, because usually what we want an answer to our question. We want to know what the good life is. We want to know what to do. Simple, black, white, good, bad, good, evil, sort the world out, parcel it all out, and let's live a happy life as a result of that. And Buddhism says it doesn't ever work like that. It's this constant effort to continually to realize more virtuosic patterns of relationality.
And continuing with this, so when we're talking through the relationality or the relational metaphysics of Buddhism and how the implication, can you hear that? Okay. I'll let Alex take this one. So.
Amy has some lawn work going on around her house today, so everybody will forge ahead. No big deal. Oh, go ahead, Amy. Yeah, you're okay. We can hear you.
Can you hear it? I don't know if it's
No, you're fine. Just go for it.
fine. Okay, and it's okay because we can edit it out. We're moving right along and being. So anyway, so coming back to this, Buddhism, as you define it, is a relational metaphysics of mutual implication and interdependence that transforms one relation to self and the world. So how does such a metaphysics help us conceive of the nature of AI in relation to humanity and also the nature of consciousness itself, both AI and human?
Well, the simple answer to that question is we really shouldn't be talking about artificial intelligence as if machine intelligence was something that had nothing to do with us human beings. In fact, we should really be talking about synthetic intelligences. And to the extent that what we're doing with machines is we're going from machines that could do simple things like arithmetic for us, perform calculations for us, to now machines that can actually think creatively in a closed creative manner in terms of being able to innovate to give us solutions to problems that we human beings have that we couldn't come up with on our own. They're doing that on the basis of taking human intelligence, reading out from human intelligence through our data, using that data then to recognize patterns and to develop new sets of practices to address the problems that we've got. So actually, we're already an interdependent relationship with these machine intelligences. Hence, we should really be talking about synthetic intelligence. Human technology world relationships are always relationships through which we remake our worlds. We change our environments. We build new kinds of domiciles, from small tent-like huts to skyscrapers. We change things depending on our technologies. But our technologies also inform who we are. If consciousness is relational, you cannot change how you live domestically without changing your domestic consciousness. You can't change where you live without changing how you live. What Buddhism seeks in taking this idea of interdependence really, really seriously and embedding that in a critique of technology, not just of tools, but of technologies, it gets us to start questioning some really basic moves that we're making in terms of how we're synthesizing human and machine intelligences. So by analogy, think of what, say, elevators did to human life. Elevators are really simple transportation technology. They just lift people up in a building, right? Up and down. It's really simple, straightforward. What elevators made possible, though, is going beyond buildings that were maybe 4 or 5 stories tall comfortably, just to buildings that were 40, 50, 100 stories tall, right? What did that do? Well, that changed the dynamics of urban landscapes. Suddenly, you could have thousands of people living where just a few dozen used to live. If you got thousands of people living there, where do they get their food? They're not getting it from neighborhood little shops. They have to get it from really big stores. How do they get there? Well, they have to have mass transportation. How do they, you get all these concatenative effects from a tool, a very simple tool, like an elevator. Did anybody who was inventing elevators in the 19th century, the people who were first using and putting them into buildings, they didn't think about how it's going to change their cities. They were just thinking for the elderly, for the small, for people carrying packages to get up in the building. It allows you to have an office building where you can get, supplies up and down readily. You could put factories on the 5th floor and move stuff right down through those. It transformed what you could do in a building. That's all they were thinking. They weren't thinking it's going to change the character of urban life completely. We now know, looking back, how dramatic that change was, how it created conditions for entirely new ways of living in cities. It got rid of, in many places, the neighborhood, of neighborliness as a phenomenon of living together. So what we're worried about with intelligent technology and the synthesis of machine and human intelligence is, what are we going to have in terms of transformations of things as basic as remembering, parenting, teaching and learning, securing ourselves, whether our homes, whether our nations, etc., in terms of health and healing. These are basic human practices, intelligent human practices that we've been doing without the aid of synthesizing our human intelligence with computational algorithmic intelligences. As we do that, do we know where the changes are going to go? Do we know any better than the people who were putting elevators into buildings 150 years ago knew what they were setting in motion? We do not. What Buddhism says, though, is if you look at the values that are embedded, you can have premonitions of where things are headed. You might not be able to predict things accurately, but you can see the broad sweep as I played on that karmic cycle of control. You could see the broad sweep of where we're heading. And that's really why we need to be concerned. Because what we're potentially trading off is not just using smart systems to supplement our human abilities. That's great, that's wonderful, you know? But what if they start to supplant our capacities for engaging in intelligent human practices? And the most basic of these is the capacity to pay sustained attention. Being mindful, being present for more than a few milliseconds at a time as images are shifting on a screen and you get captured by that and your attention just goes down the rabbit hole of whatever the YouTube sequences are. I mean, you see it in young people today. I've got a 19-year-old son, and I could just see his mind getting sucked in. And can he pay attention? Well, he's my son, so I taught him how to meditate. I know that he can sit on a cushion for 15 minutes and not move. That's amazing for an 18, 19-year-old. But what's going on inside? Is he actually focused? Is he actually in that open space of clear, present engagement? I'm not sure. Based on his behavior and his decision-making, I don't think so. And so what I'm saying is that what Buddhism provides, in addition to a critical set of tools that we can use to assess this situation, an ethical system that says it's not a one-stop here, we've got the goal we're seeking, because it's an open-ended opportunity for ethical creativity. It's also giving us a set of practices that says, if you're serious about this and you want to be present as you need to be in order to resolve the predicaments of intelligent technology or climate change or any of the rest of them, we obviously need to be different, present as than we've been in the past. We have not been present as the kinds of persons we need to be to negotiate the global agreements, to set in motion the commitments that will get this stuff to happen. We have failed. Everything about our lives shows us we failed on something like climate change and addressing hunger, two simple ones. So when it comes to intelligent technology, the thing that we really must insist on is regaining freedom of attention in order to be able to conserve what freedom of intention we continue to have, and then to be able to have the critical resources to be able to evaluate value systems in light of whether they're producing virtuosic, superlative outcomes and opportunities, or merely good ones or mediocre ones, and to make appropriate changes. I mean, other traditions could do this. I don't think Buddhism is unique in this, but I think that once you adopt this relational way of understanding the world, a relational ontology thoroughly, where things are ultimately relational and individually existing things are abstractions from that. That's part of the Buddhist metaphysics, that individually existing things are abstractions. They're conceptual constructs. They don't exist in the world except that we put our energy into continuing that kind of relationship, a limited relationship. So for those of us who, to make it concrete, who have pets, say a dog. There are parts of the world where they eat dogs. Dogs are food, not family members. And that makes a real difference. The concept of the dog, what's the dog? The dog is neither food nor a family member. A dog, independent in and of itself, is charging around and acting the way dogs act. but we can change the way they act. We can turn them into lab creatures. We can run experiments on them. So the Buddhist perspective is there isn't a world out there. This goes back to Alex's question about, whether it's idealist or, physicalist metaphysics. It's actually neither. It's a metaphysics of values infused relational dynamics all the way down. And the worlds that we're living in are the worlds that have been brought into being and allowed to continue to persist because of intentions and values that have been playing out from time immemorial. So the physical cosmos that we're a part of is a record of what has been differentiated as what matters. Matter is a record of what has mattered cosmically.